In 2024, it was clear Americans had only one thing on their mind: the economy. Following the inflation crisis from the pandemic, life became significantly more unaffordable. Groceries cost more,
Why is cereal $10?
rent stayed high,
Who in the hell are affording to move into these ridiculously high, overpriced, expensive apartments?
and interest rates made buying a home feel impossible.
My mortgage on my starter home is $4,845 every single month.
And even basic comfort started to feel like luxuries in America. The American dream was slipping away from our fingertips. People longed for a time that once was. A time when you could provide for a family of four on one salary, not be crippled by student loan debt, and where the basic milestones of adulthood, buying a home, raising kids, and building a decent life, was not something that was just for the wealthy. When Trump came along with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," it resonated with millions of Americans who longed for simpler times. In places like the Rust Belt, where manufacturing had once been the backbone of local economies, that message hit especially hard. Decades of economic decline had left behind shuttered factories, lost jobs, and a deep sense that the American system was no longer working. The divide between the have and have-nots is growing wider each and every year, with no end in sight. So when Trump was elected in 2024 to fix the economy, why have things gotten so much worse?
And I'd like to begin by asking a very simple question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
To answer that question, we need to go back to 2016, where it all started. Trump's core message was that America had become too expensive and too weak compared to its glory days in the past. And during his presidency, from 2016 to 2019, the economy did pretty well. It wasn't until 2020 when the virus finally hit. And fast forward a few years later, inflation goes through the roof, and the economy starts to really panic and crumble. The public was desperate for a change. And actually, Pew found that the economy was the dominant issue for voters in 2024, with 81% saying it was very important to their vote. For the majority of Americans, it really is as simple as life was better under Trump's presidency. But was that because of COVID? Or because of his policies? Trump had promised to reverse the ruin followed by the pandemic through mass deportations, tariffs, and focusing on industries like oil and manufacturing in the US. The pitch was straightforward. America had become more expensive because it had gotten weaker, more dependent, and less willing to put its own interests first. That's where the idea of America first came about. He wasn't offering a complicated explanation filled with caveats and trade-offs. He was offering something much more powerful politically. A simple slogan: make America great again. America had fallen into decline. Someone was to blame. And with the right leadership, that decline could be reversed. That message landed because by 2024, people were exhausted. They were tired of paying more for groceries, more for rent, more for gas, and more for everyday life while being told the economy was recovering. The American people didn't want to be gaslit into believing that the economy was improving. And under every administration, right or left, the people are constantly gaslit. People wanted relief. Trump's message gave emotional clarity to millions of Americans who felt like the country they grew up in was slipping away. And that clarity was a huge part of why his promise still resonated. What made Trump's message so powerful was not that it explained everything perfectly. It was that it felt emotionally true for everyday Americans. By election year, millions of Americans felt like they were working harder just to get by. One paycheck no longer stretched the way it used to. Owning a home felt increasingly out of reach, and their parents' version of adulthood seemed more stable than their own. Even looking back in the 90s, which wasn't that long ago, buying a typical home took about 1/5 of a family's income. Now it takes about more than 1/3. In that kind of environment, people are looking for a story that makes their frustration make sense. And that's why the message worked. It took a messy, complicated reality and turned it into something emotionally clear. America had declined, ordinary people had been ignored, and someone was finally promising to restore order. In places that had already lived through decades of decline, especially parts of the Rust Belt, that message hit especially harder. Manufacturing employment remains far below older peaks, and that long backdrop of industrial loss helps explain why nostalgia still carries so much weight. So what happened? The promise was a better economy, no new wars. But what a lot of Americans got instead was the exact opposite. A worsening economy, AI replacing jobs at a rapid pace, and instead of spending money to help Americans at home, we're instead starting a new war in Iran, focusing on Greenland, Venezuela, Cuba, any other country but us. And that matters because gas is one of the fastest ways that people realize something is wrong in their wallet. Since the US-Israel war with Iran began, US pump prices have jumped more than 30%, rising to about $3.88 a gallon, with forecasts pointing to above $4. And right now, 55% of Americans say that higher gas prices are already hurting their household finances, and 87% expect prices to keep on rising. But it's not just about gas. The broader mood is horrible because people were told they were voting for order, but instead they're watching the country slide into more instability abroad, while life at home is still expensive. The Iran war is now entering its 4th week. Thousands more US troops are being sent to the region, and most Americans believe this can turn into a larger ground war, even though a tiny minority actually support it. The economic picture isn't helping either. Hiring is cooled, payrolls fell by 92,000 in February, unemployment edged up to 4.4%, and businesses are pulling back amid high borrowing costs, tariffs, and energy shocks. So when people say, "I thought this was supposed to get better," that isn't just frustration talking. It is a real reaction to a reality that feels punishing. It's interesting because Trump ran on the economy and affordability, but housing costs have been the biggest obstacle between the American people and the American dream. But in Trump's own words, well, I'll let him say it for you.
I can turn on housing immediately, but you make it too easy and you're going to knock the value down of people that own houses. I want to, for those people, those millions of people that own houses, we're going to drive those values up.
And that's probably the most out of touch thing he said, especially given what's going on in the economy right now. And that's even worse than his comment before about getting a small loan of $1 million. This is the moment where hope turns into resentment. People are willing to put up with the antics, with Trump's behavior, because they're like, well, maybe the economy will get better. Maybe our wallets will stop hurting as much. Maybe we'll finally be able to afford the things that make us an adult. Like, our own place, being able to raise children affordably, being able to get a nicer car, being able to live the American dream, essentially. People were willing to believe the story because they wanted relief. But when groceries are still high, gas spikes again, jobs feel shakier, and the country is suddenly talking about Iran, Greenland, and military power instead of peace and affordability, the feeling isn't just disappointment, it's betrayal. And even the polling reflects that. Trump's approval on cost of living had fallen to 29%, down from 35% in the previous poll. Only 35% of Americans approve of his handling of the economy overall. For a president who's built his entire brand on the economy and making money, those are pretty brutal numbers. The Trump admin had prided itself on being transparent, blunt, and escaping traditional politics. But now we're watching the administration fall back on the same old playbook. Deflect, distract, and tell everybody everything's great while their actual lives say otherwise. And you can see that in the way the administration talks. At a hearing over the Epstein files, Pam Bondi brushed over the issue and said, Dow's over 50,000. Well, I'll let her speak for herself.
The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about.
She also called Trump the most transparent president in the nation's history. And that's exactly the kind of response that people are reacting to. Not because markets don't matter, but it feels like they're talking about the stock market, while the public is asking about trust, transparency, and the cost of living. The same thing shows up in Trump's economic messaging. Across many of his speeches on the economy, he said inflation was beaten, prices were falling. I think one of his speeches in Iowa, he said, inflation has stopped, incomes are up, and prices are down.
Inflation has stopped, incomes are up, prices are down.
But the problem is people know what they're paying. They know what groceries cost, they know what rent costs, and what filling up the gas tank costs. The gap between the official message and lived reality is where anger starts to harden. And then there's the foreign policy. Trump sold himself as the candidate who would keep America out of new wars, especially in the Middle East. But now Iran is dominating headlines, and even the White House is saying, no official decision has been made regarding ground troops, but Trump's keeping all options open at this time. And there have been some reports about administration officials talking about involving ground troops in Iran, despite the campaign promise to avoid new Middle East wars and entanglements. And that's why it feels like such a bait and switch for people. They voted for stability and instead got more escalation, more uncertainty, and more pressure at home as gas prices rise again. The truth is, a lot of these problems are older than Trump, older than Biden, and a lot older than people even realize. You can make the case that one of the biggest turning points came in the early 1970s when the United States fully moved away from the gold-backed dollar. That didn't magically create every single issue we have now, but it did help usher in a very different kind of economy. One built more on fiat money, debt, and asset inflation. Even the Fed's own history points to the end of the gold standard and the end of Bretton Woods as part of the backdrop to that inflationary era that has followed since. And when you zoom out, it all starts to come together. Since the late 1970s, the economy kept growing, but ordinary workers have not felt that growth in their own lives. Productivity rose, but pay didn't keep up at the same pace. Assets like housing became much more important, which was great if you already owned them, but brutal if you were trying to actually buy your way in for the first time. And that's why so many people feel like they're running on a treadmill. The numbers can go up, the stock market can hit record highs, but it can still feel like everyday life is just stressful for the average American. This problem supersedes presidents and the government in general, in a sense. Presidents can create trade policy, energy policy, regulations, but they can't undo 50 years of debt, housing scarcity, and leaving us off the gold standard and the effects that has brought us since. And that's why people get so angry. You have all these politicians offering immediate relief, but the reality is they're just going to keep on pushing the can down the road until someone else can deal with it. Just recently, Powell said that after recent reporting, there had effectively been zero net private sector job creation over the last 6 months. So that feeling of stagnation isn't just coming out of thin air. It's grounded in reality. And that's also why in the last decade or so, some people started looking at more radical alternatives, whether that means going back to gold, turning to cryptocurrency, or just searching for any system that just feels more honest than the one that's currently in place right now. So what happens next? I consider myself a pretty optimistic person, but the truth is the future is very unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, or even 15 years. On one hand, AI advancements can usher in this new renaissance period for America. We can completely change what it means to work and have robots and AI agents doing everything for us, while we live off of their productivity and revenue. Or it can be the exact opposite. We could live in a world where every single job is replaced by AI and robotics, and the government and companies have no plan to take care of the people that they left behind. There could be 30-40% unemployment rates with no hope in sight. There could be a civil war, or something even much worse. And that's really the question hanging over all of this. The future might be incredible, but if all that progress doesn't actually make a life more affordable, more stable, and more like the American dream that we all know and love, then people are still gonna feel like the system is failing them. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you guys want to see some more video essays on politics, the economy, and just overall Gen Z topics, then stay tuned for the next videos. See you for the next one. Peace.